Frost already hardened the mud by the cabin door. Harlan watched the women from town turn back down the trail, their heavy skirts dragging through the slush. They always came with pies and pity, and he always sent them packing. He liked the quiet. He liked the cold. But then the wind shifted, carrying the scent of lye, soap, and desperation, and a voice barely louder than the snapping pine needles asked a question that tore his solitude wide open. Another winter alone, or a wife. Blood slicked Harlan's forearms, drying into stiff, rusty flakes against his skin. He plunged his knife into the buck's belly, the blade parting the hide with a wet, tearing sound. Steam billowed from the open cavity, carrying the heavy copper stench of fresh death and a half-digested sweetgrass into the freezing November air. He worked mechanically. Cut-pull separate. His joints ached, a deep, grinding throb in his right shoulder that flared every time the temperature dropped below freezing, and it had been dropping for a week. Down in the valley, the town of Oakhaven was probably battening down the hatches, caulking windows, stockpiling firewood, hoarding flour. Up here at 6,000 feet, winter didn't just arrive. It slammed into the mountain like a freight train. He threw the entrails to the side for the scavengers, wiping his blade on a fistful of dry pine needles. That was when he heard it. The rhythm was wrong. Animals moved with purpose or panic. This sound was a clumsy, exhausted drag. Boot scraping over rock. A pause. A heavy intake of breath. Then another scrape. Harlan didn't reach for his rifle. The footsteps were too slow for a threat too heavy for a predator. He stood up, wiping his bloody hands on his leather apron, and looked down the winding, rutted path that led back to civilization. A woman was dragging herself up the final incline. He groaned internally, a bitter sound that tasted like old coffee in the back of his throat. Another one. The church ladies in Oakhaven had been trying to domesticate him since his brother died 3 years ago. They sent up widows with casseroles, spinsters with mending baskets, all of them wearing soft, terrified smiles, hoping to tame the mountain man and secure a cabin that didn't leak. He had run off Martha Higgins by skinning a badger on the kitchen table while she tried to talk about the Lord. He had driven off Sarah Jenkins by simply refusing to speak to her for 4 hours straight. But this woman wasn't carrying a pie. She wore a man's wool coat 3 sizes too big, the hem stiff with frozen mud. Her face was half hidden by a grey woolen scarf, but he could see her eyes. They weren't soft or pleading. They were flat, the color of slate. She reached the edge of his clearing, stopped, and leaned heavily against a scarred ponderosa pine. Her breath punched into the air in ragged white clouds. "You're lost," Harlan said. His voice was gravelly from disuse, grating against the absolute silence of the mountain. He turned back to the deer. "Town's 5 miles back down. If you leave now, you might beat the dark." She didn't move. The smell of her drifted over the metallic tang of the deer, blood-strong lye soap, stale sweat, and damp wool. "I'm not lost," she said. Her voice was cracked raw around the edges like she had been swallowing sand. Harlan grabbed a meat saw and began working through the buck's ribs. The bone crunched a harsh, violent sound. He wanted her to flinch. She didn't. She just watched him. He could feel her gaze on the back of his neck, heavy and irritating. "No charity here," he grunted, bearing down on the saw. "I don't need my socks darned, and I don't want to hear about Jesus. I didn't come to preach, and I don't give a damn about your socks." Harlan stopped sawing. He turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. She stepped away from the tree. She was shivering a violent, full-body tremor that she was trying desperately to suppress. Her hands bare and red as raw meat clutched the edges of the oversized coat. "Name's Sadie," she said. She didn't offer a last name. Out here last names usually carried debts or warrants. "I hear you run off every woman who comes up this ridge, and you thought you'd try your luck." Harlan scoffed, turning back to the carcass. "Go home, Sadie. It's gonna snow tonight. I don't have a home." The words weren't a plea for pity. They were stated as a geographic fact. Harlan paused again. He looked at her boots. They were men's boots stuffed with rags at the ankles to make them fit the leather, cracked and leaking. She wouldn't survive the walk back down. Not in the dark. Not in this cold. Not my problem, he said, forcing the words out. It was a survival mechanism. Pity got you killed up here. Complications got you starved. Sadie took another step forward. She stopped near the pile of steaming entrails, not even wrinkling her nose at the stench. She looked past him at the sturdy log cabin, the massive cord of split firewood stacked against the eastern wall, the smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. "You've got enough wood to burn till June," she said, her voice dropping. The wind howled through the high branches, threatening to drown her out. She pulled the scarf down, revealing a face sharp with hunger lips, chapped and splitting. "You've got a tight roof, but you're slow. I watched you walk from the woodpile. Your right leg drags and your shoulders stiff. Winter's long. If you get sick, you die alone in that box." Harlan's jaw tightened. He gripped the handle of his knife so hard his knuckles turned white. "I said go home." She took a breath, her chest rising under the heavy wool. She looked him dead in the eye, stripping away any pretense of courtship or modesty. It was a transaction. Raw and ugly. Another winter alone. She whispered the words, carrying an edge of sharp, desperate iron. Or a wife. Harlan laughed. It was a dry, barking sound, devoid of any humor. He drove his knife point first into the chopping block, wiping his hands on a rag. A wife, he repeated, tasting the absurdity of the word. He looked her up and down. "You're offering yourself up for a warm bed and half a deer. I'm offering to keep the fire going when you can't get out of bed." Sadie counted, her chin tipping up. "I'm offering to salt the meat patch, the roof, and dig the latrine path when the drifts hit 6 feet. I work harder than any man you could hire, and I take up less space. I don't hire men. I don't hire anyone." Harlan grabbed the buck's hind legs, hoisted the carcass onto a gambrel, and hauled it up into the oak tree to drain. His shoulder screamed in protest, a hot wire of pain shooting down to his elbow. He gritted his teeth, refusing to show it. "I live alone. I die alone. That's the arrangement I made with this mountain." "Then you're a fool," she said evenly. Harlan spun around, his temper finally catching. "Look around you, woman. Does it look like I need saving?" He gestured aggressively at the cabin, the well-kept tools, the cured hides. "You come up here freezing in rags and tell me I'm the one who needs help. You're a stray dog begging for scraps." The insult landed. He saw it in the infinitesimal flinch of her eyes, the way her jaw clamped shut. But she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stared at him with that same unnerving, flat gaze. "Maybe I am," she said quietly. "But a stray dog will bite the throat out of anything that tries to enter your camp at night. Can you say the same about your pride?" Harlan stared at her. The wind whipped her loose hair a dull, dusty brown across her face. She was shivering so hard now that her teeth were audibly clicking together. The light was failing fast. The grey sky was bruising into a deep purple black, and the temperature was plummeting. The mud beneath their boots was already turning to concrete. "Get down the mountain, Sadie." He turned his back on her, grabbed his knife and the saw, and walked toward the cabin. He opened the heavy oak door, the hinges protesting with a loud screech. The heat from inside rolled out to greet him, smelling of wood smoke, old coffee, and dried sage. It was his sanctuary. He stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The latch clicked into place. It sounded terrifyingly final. Harlan walked to the wash basin. He poured water from a tin pitcher, the water so cold it stung his hands. He scrubbed the dried blood from his skin with a stiff brush and a chunk of lye soap. He took his time. He methodically dried his hands on a towel. He walked to the cast-iron stove, picked up a poker, and shifted the glowing coals, feeding 2 thick, split logs of hickory into the belly of the fire. He didn't look at the window. He absolutely refused to look at the window. He sat down in his rocking chair, picking up a piece of harness leather he had been oiling. He worked the neat's foot oil into the grain with his thumbs. 5 minutes passed. The wind began to shriek, a high-pitched whistling through the chinking in the logs. 10 minutes. A sharp patter of sound hit the window pane. Sleet. Hard, freezing rain that would turn to snow within the hour. Harlan swore violently, throwing the leather onto the floor. He stood up, pacing the length of the small cabin. He hated her. He hated her for coming up here, he hated her for being right about his shoulder, and most of all, he hated that she was standing outside his door, freezing to death. If he let her die on his porch, he'd have to bury her in the spring when the ground thawed. That was a lot of digging. He marched to the door, grabbed the iron handle, and yanked it open. Sadie was exactly where he had left her. She had sunk to her knees beside the chopping block. She had pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible against the biting sleet. She looked up when the door opened. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. "Get in here," Harlan snarled. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for a hand up. She forced herself onto her stiff legs, stumbling slightly, and walked past him into the cabin. The immediate contrast of the heat hit her like a physical blow. She swayed, grabbing the back of a wooden dining chair to steady herself. Harlan slammed the door shut, locking the wind outside. "Don't touch anything," he barked. "Stand by the stove." She hobbled toward the iron behemoth, her stiff fingers struggling to unbutton the enormous wool coat. Harlan watched her fumble with it, annoyed by her weakness. He stepped forward, swatting her hands away, and unbuttoned the coat himself. He pulled it off her shoulders. The smell of wet, dirty wool filled the tight space. Underneath, she wore a faded, patched cotton dress that offered zero protection against the cold. She was dangerously thin. He could see the sharp ridge of her collarbones, the hollows of her throat. He tossed the wet coat over a chair. "Take the boots off. Your feet are going to rot." She sat down heavily on the floor near the stove, her fingers numbly pulling at the frozen rags around her ankles. She managed to yank the ruined boots off. Her toes were stark white, bordering on frostbite. Harlan cursed again, walking to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He dug through it and threw a pair of thick grey woolen socks at her. "Put those on. Don't rub your feet, just let them thaw slow." She pulled the socks on silently. She sat cross-legged by the stove, the heat slowly returning the colour to her face. The silence in the cabin was thick, oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the hickory logs and the ticking of a tin clock on the mantel. "I'm not marrying you," Harlan said suddenly, standing over her like a dark cloud. Sadie looked up at him. The blue was fading from her lips, replaced by a raw, painful red. "I didn't ask for a ring. I asked for a winter. You stay on that side of the room," he dictated, pointing a calloused finger at her. "You don't touch my tools. You don't touch my rifle. You pull your weight or I throw you back out in the snow. Frostbite be damned." "You understand?" "Yes. I mean it, Sadie. No talking just to hear your own voice. I like the quiet." She stared at him, the heat radiating off the cast iron behind her. "I like the quiet too, Harlan. The world's loud enough as it is." He blinked. He hadn't told her his name. She had known it before she walked up the trail. He scowled, turning away to grab the coffee pot. The deal was struck not with a handshake or a vow, but with the clatter of a tin cup on a wooden table. The first 2 weeks were a study in misery. Harlan felt like a bear trapped in a cave with a badger. The cabin, which had felt comfortably spacious for 3 years, suddenly felt the size of a coffin. Every sound she made grated on his nerves. The rustle of the straw tick he had grudgingly built for her in the corner nearest the stove, the clink of her spoon against the tin plate, the sound of her breathing in the dark. He found himself waking up at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware that another human being was exhaling the air he was trying to breathe. But Sadie was true to her word. She worked like a demon. She was up before dawn, silently building the fire from the banked coals. When Harlan rolled out of bed, there was already coffee boiling. But it wasn't his coffee. On the 3rd morning, he took a sip from his mug and immediately spat it into the slop bucket. "What in the hell did you do to this?" he demanded, slamming the mug down on the table. Sadie didn't look up from where she was scrubbing a cast iron skillet. I put crushed eggshells in the grounds. Why, it settles the bitterness, and it stretches the beans. I like it, bitter Harlan snapped. I like it thick enough to patch a roof. If I wanted tea, I'd have asked for tea. Coffee costs $1 a pound in town, she replied, evenly rinsing the pan. You've got maybe 4 pounds left. Winter's going to last till May. Do the math, Harlan. He wanted to scream at her. He wanted to throw the coffee out the door. But he knew she was right. And worse, he hated to admit that it actually tasted better, smoother burning, less going down. He drank it in sullen silence, glaring at the back of her head. They moved around each other like strangers in a narrow alley, constantly shifting to avoid brushing shoulders. But the proximity was unavoidable. He smelled her sweat when she came back from chopping kindling. He saw the way her hair, unpinned and wild, hung in damp strands around her face when the cabin got too hot. He saw the ugly purple bruises on her shins when she accidentally hitched her skirt up too high while stepping over a log. She wasn't a soft woman. Her hands were rougher than a carpenter's, her knuckles permanently stained with ash and dirt. But there was a strange, raw resilience to her that he couldn't ignore. The friction peaked in the 3rd week. Harlan was sitting by the window, painstakingly honing the edge of his hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shk sound filled the room. Sadie was sweeping the floor with a broom made of tied pine boughs. She swept near his chair, the dust swirling up into the shafts of grey light. Watch the boots, he muttered, pulling his feet back. Lift them, she said flatly. He paused, the knife resting against the stone. I ain't lifting my boots in my own house. She stopped sweeping. She leaned on the makeshift broom handle, looking down at him. Her eyes were exhausted, ringed with deep purple shadows. It's dirt, Harlan. You track it in. I sweep it out. If you don't lift your boots, I can't sweep it out. It's a very simple system. The system, he growled, standing up slowly, towering over her, is that you are a guest here. You work around me. She didn't back down. She didn't shrink away from his size or the knife in his hand. I'm not a guest. I'm a partner. You agreed to the trade. I agreed to let you live. And I am keeping you alive. She shot back, her voice finally rising above its usual monotone. Who do you think skinned those rabbits yesterday while your shoulder was locked up so bad you couldn't lift a spoon? Who patched the hole in the chinking by the bed so the wind wouldn't freeze you solid in your sleep? Don't act like you're doing me a favor, old man. We need each other. The words old man hit him like a physical blow. He was only 42, but the mountain had weathered him. The lines on his face were deep. The grey in his beard was spreading. He stared at her, the anger boiling up in his chest, warring with an uncomfortable, terrifying respect. Before he could retort, the cabin grew suddenly ominously dark. The grey light coming through the window vanished, replaced by a dense, suffocating white. The wind, which had been a constant howling companion for weeks, suddenly dropped entirely. The silence that followed was heavy. It pressed against the eardrums. Harlan looked past her towards the window. The sky had disappeared. The world outside was gone. Barometer just dropped the bottom out. He muttered, his anger evaporating, instantly replaced by the primal instinct of a survivalist. Storm Sadie asked, turning to look. Blizzard, Harlan corrected, walking to the door and throwing the heavy iron deadbolt across it. He grabbed a rag and stuffed it into the crack beneath the door. A real one. It's going to dump 3 feet by morning, and it's going to drift to 10. He turned back to look at her. The petty squabble over dirt and boots was forgotten. The mountain had just reminded them both who was actually in charge. We're locked in, he said, his voice dropping an octave. We won't be able to open that door for at least 3 days, maybe a week. Sadie swallowed hard. She looked around the tiny one-room cabin. 10 feet by 15 feet, a stove, a bed, a table, and a pile of straw. 2 people. For a week. No escape. Then I guess we better figure out how to stand each other, she said softly, the smell of snow and iron creeping through the floorboards. 3 days into the whiteout, the cabin smelled of stale sweat wood ash and simmering resentment. The snow hadn't just fallen, it had entombed them. The single window was a solid, impenetrable wall of packed white ice, blocking out the sun and warping the passage of time into an endless, suffocating twilight. They lived by the rhythm of the cast-iron stove. Wake, feed the fire, melt snow for water, hack off a chunk of frozen venison, boil it, eat in silence. Sleep. Space became a physical weapon. The cabin was 10 by 15 feet. Harlan couldn't stretch his legs without kicking the edge of Sadie's straw tick. She couldn't sweep without brushing her skirts against his boots. They moved around each other with the rigid, calculated caution of two feral cats locked in a burlap sack. By the fourth afternoon, the barometric pressure dropped so low it felt like a physical weight pressing against Harlan's skull. But the real casualty was his shoulder. The old wound, a nasty tear from a grizzly's claws, a decade past, always ached in the damp. But trapped in the stagnant, freezing air of the cabin, the joint didn't just ache. It locked. The cartilage felt like ground glass. A hot, jagged wire of agony shot from his collarbone down to his knuckles every time he twitched his fingers. He sat in his rocking chair, his right arm pinned stiffly against his ribs, trying to breathe through his nose. His jaw was clamped so tight his teeth ground together. He needed to split kindling. The indoor pile was down to 3 meager sticks, and the fire was dying back to red embers. He pushed himself up. His vision swam for a fraction of a second. He ignored it. He walked to the woodpile near the door, picking up the short-handled indoor hatchet with his left hand. He tried to transfer it to his right. His fingers wouldn't close around the hickory grip. The hatchet clattered onto the floorboards with a loud, ringing thud. Sadie, who had been aggressively scrubbing a tin plate with a handful of coarse salt, stopped. Harlan cursed a low, ugly sound in the back of his throat. He bent down, grabbing the tool with his left hand again, clumsy and off balance. He set a chunk of pine on the chopping block. He raised the hatchet awkwardly. "You're going to take off your kneecap." Her voice cut through the heavy air, devoid of sympathy. Just a blunt observation of fact. "Mind your business." Harlan snapped, bringing the blade down. It struck the pine off-center, glancing off the wood and biting deep into the floor beside his boot. Sadie dropped the tin plate. It hit the table with a clatter. She marched across the tiny room, the hem of her oversized dress swishing against the floorboards. She didn't ask. She reached out her rough, cold hands clamping over his left wrist, forcing him to release the hatchet handle. "Get off me!" he growled, trying to pull away. But the movement jerked his bad shoulder. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth before he could bite it back. Sadie didn't flinch. She picked up the hatchet. "Sit down, Harlan. You're useless right now." He wanted to throw her through the wall. His pride, brittle and defensive, flared hot in his chest. "I don't need a woman doing my work. There is no men's work or women's work in a blizzard," she replied, setting a fresh piece of wood on the block. "There is only dead and alive. Go sit down before you bleed on my clean floor." She raised the hatchet and brought it down in a clean, vicious arc. The pine split with a satisfying crack. She wasn't strong, but she was precise. She used the weight of the tool, her whole body pivoting into the swing. Harlan backed away, sinking heavily onto the edge of his bed. He hated watching her do it. He hated the pale, strained line of her neck as she worked. But mostly he hated the relief radiating through his own right arm, now that he wasn't forcing it to move. She chopped enough kindling to last the night, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. When she finished, she gathered the wood in her apron and dumped it loudly into the copper bucket beside the stove. Then she turned to him. "Take off your shirt." Harlan narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me, your shirt. Take it off." She walked to the small shelf above the wash basin, digging through a collection of small canvas bags and tin tins. "I saw you guarding that arm yesterday. Today you can't even hold a handle. It's inflamed. It's fine." "It's locked solid," she corrected, pulling a small mortar and pestle from the shelf. She dumped a handful of dried willow bark into the bowl, followed by a pinch of crushed cayenne pepper and something that smelled sharply of pine tar. "Take the shirt off or I'll cut it off." He glared at her, but the grinding agony in his joint was overriding his stubbornness. With excruciating slowness, using only his left hand, he unbuttoned his heavy flannel shirt and eased it off his left shoulder. Getting it over the right side was a slow torture. He had to bend sideways, letting gravity do the work, his breath hissing out in ragged pulls. When the shirt finally dropped to his waist, he sat exposed. His torso was mapped with scars, pale, jagged lines from knives' falls and teeth. But the shoulder was the worst. The skin over the joint was a violent, angry red, swollen tight and radiating heat. Sadie walked over, holding a wooden bowl filled with a dark, foul-smelling paste. She didn't hesitate. She didn't offer a warning or a soft touch. She plunged her bare fingers into the paste and slapped a thick glob of it directly onto the inflamed joint. Harlan nearly jumped off the bed. Jesus Christ, what is that willow bark for the ache pepper to pull the blood to the surface and rendered bear fat? She dug her thumbs directly into the tight, knotted muscle at the base of his neck. He yelled, trying to jerk away, but she stepped in closer, trapping his left arm against his side with her hip gaining leverage. "Hold still," she commanded. Her hands were brutal. There was no gentle massage, no soothing strokes. She dug her knuckles into the calcified knots, grinding the foul-smelling paste deep into the pores of his skin. It burned. The pepper bit into his flesh like tiny needles, and her thumbs felt like iron spikes driving into his collarbone. "You're breaking it," he hissed, through clenched teeth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the drafty room. "I'm breaking the fascia," she said, panting slightly from the exertion. She didn't let up. She worked her fingers down the back of his shoulder blade, finding a knot the size of a walnut, and bearing down with all her body weight. Harlan let out a low groan, his chin dropping to his chest. The pain was blinding, sharp enough to bring tears to his eyes, but beneath the agonizing pressure, something was happening. A slow, agonizing release. The rigid, frozen muscle fibers were finally giving way, yielding to the raw friction and the burning heat of the poultice. They stayed like that for 10 minutes. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire, the howling wind outside, and the ragged, synchronized rhythm of their breathing. She smelled like wood smoke and old soap. He smelled like sweat and pain. They were inches apart, separated only by necessity, and the thin, brutal reality of survival. Finally, she pulled her hands away. She grabbed a clean rag and wiped the excess grease from his skin, her touch suddenly lighter, almost hesitant. "Keep it warm," she muttered, turning away quickly to wash her hands in the cold basin. Harlan slowly rolled his right shoulder. The joint popped a loud, hollow crack that echoed in the small room. The sharp, blinding pain was gone. A deep, throbbing soreness remained, but the lock was broken. He could move his arm. He looked at her back as she scrubbed her hands. He pulled his shirt up clumsily, buttoning it with his left hand. "Obliged," he muttered. It was the hardest word he had spoken in 3 years. Sadie didn't turn around. "Keep the fire hot, that's all I ask." Silence woke him. For 6 days the blizzard had been a physical presence in the room, a roaring beast tearing at the heavy logs, screaming down the chimney, rattling the iron hinges. But now it was gone. The absolute absence of sound was so sudden and profound, it felt like a vacuum pressing against Harlan's eardrums. He lay still on his bed, the heavy wool blankets pulled up to his chin. The air in the cabin was bitterly cold. The stove had burned down to ash. He turned his head. Sadie was awake. She was sitting on her straw tick in the corner, her knees pulled tight to her chest, the oversized wool coat draped over her shoulders like a shroud. She was staring at the dead iron belly of the stove. The pale, weak light of a late winter dawn was trying to filter through the cracks in the door, casting long grey shadows across her face. She looked hollowed out. Harlan threw off his blankets. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his long johns. He walked to the stove, grabbing the poker. He stirred the grey ash. A tiny, glowing red ember the size of a dime winked up at him from the very bottom. He didn't speak. He gathered dry pine needles and a few splinters of kindling, blowing softly onto the ember. The faint glow flared, catching the resin. A tiny ribbon of smoke curled upward, followed by a fragile yellow flame. He fed it carefully, building it back into a roaring fire. The heat began to push back the frost. He stood up, walking over to the wooden floorboards near the foot of his bed. He knelt, wedged his hunting knife into a crack, and pried up a loose board. From the dark cavity beneath, he pulled a square, dusty glass bottle. Amber liquid sloshed inside. Rye whiskey. The good stuff. He only touched it on the anniversary of his brother's death. He grabbed 2 tin cups from the table, poured a solid inch of rye into each, and walked over to Sadie. He held one out. She looked at the cup, then up at him. Her slate-grey eyes were guarded, searching his face for a trap. Finding none, she reached out. Her fingers brushed his. They were ice cold. Harlan dragged a wooden crate over and sat down a few feet from her. He took a sip. The rye burned a hot welcome trail down his throat, pooling in his stomach. Sadie didn't sip. She threw the shot back like a man facing a firing squad. She grimaced a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth as the alcohol hit her system. A faint flush of color returned to her cheeks. "Storm broke," Harlan said. His voice was gravelly quiet. "I heard," she replied, staring at the empty tin cup in her hands. "Means I gotta dig us out today. Snow's probably drifted to the roofline on the east side." She nodded, but her mind was clearly somewhere else. The silence stretched between them, but it didn't feel like a battleground anymore. The violence of the storm had burned out their hostility, leaving only a shared, bone-deep exhaustion. Why the mountain, Harlan asked suddenly. He hadn't planned to ask. The rule was no personal history. But the whiskey was loosening the tight bands in his chest. "A woman like you. You ain't afraid of work. You could get a job in a laundry down in Oakhaven, a boarding house. You didn't have to walk up here and offer yourself to a stranger." Sadie kept her eyes fixed on the cup. She ran her thumb over the dented rim. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, which somehow made the words cut deeper. "My husband was a miner," she said. "Silvery lode down in Nevada. He drank his wages and beat the rest out of me. When the vein dried up, he owed the company store $600. Harlan took another sip of his rye, watching her closely. He didn't have $600, she continued, her voice mechanically steady. But he had me. The company man. He liked my face. My husband signed a paper, traded me to him to clear the ledger." Harlan's grip on his cup tightened until the tin groaned. "I waited until they were both drunk, celebrating the transaction," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes met his, cold and hard as flint. "I took the company man's horse and I took my husband's boots. The horse threw a shoe and went lame 3 weeks ago. I walked the rest of the way." She set the empty cup down on the floor. "I can't go to Oakhaven, Harlan. A woman working in a laundry without a husband or a father is a target. The law down there won't protect a woman who ran from a lawful debt. They'd send me back, or put me in a cage." She pulled the oversized coat tighter around her throat. "I didn't come up this mountain to find a husband. I came up here because nobody looks for anything up here but ghosts and timber." Harlan stared at her. He saw the cracked leather of the oversized boots sitting by the door. Her husband's boots. He saw the bruised, battered exhaustion in her frame. She wasn't a stray dog, begging for scraps. She was a cornered wolf who had chewed off her own leg to escape a trap. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and stained. He had fled to this mountain to escape the noise, the greed, and the suffocating grief of watching his brother die of consumption in a crowded city hospital. They were both running. They had just crashed into each other at the end of the line. Harlan reached out, taking her empty cup. He poured another half-inch of rye into it and handed it back. "I ain't much for conversation," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "And I'm meaner than a snake when my shoulder acts up." Sadie took the cup. The ghost of a bitter smile touched the corner of her cracked lips. "I've survived worse than a snake. I reckon you have. Harlan knocked back the rest of his drink. He stood up the joints in his knees, popping. He grabbed his heavy canvas coat from the peg by the door. Keep the fire hot, Sadie. I'm going to go dig us a tunnel out of this grave. He threw the deadbolt and pushed his shoulder against the heavy oak door. It didn't budge. He braced his boots against the floorboards and shoved with all his weight. The door cracked open, revealing a solid wall of packed, glittering blue-white snow. He grabbed the iron flat shovel leaning against the wall. Before he stepped into the freezing breach, he looked back over his shoulder. Sadie was watching him holding the tin cup in both hands. She wasn't shivering anymore. Harlan, she called out, her voice cutting through the chill. He paused. Try not to break your other arm, she said. I don't have enough willow bark for both. Harlan grunted, pulling his hat down low over his eyes. He drove the shovel into the wall of snow. For the first time in 3 years, the sound of his own breathing didn't feel entirely alone. Sunlight, after a week of whiteout blindness, didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like a physical assault. Harlan broke through the final crust of the snowdrift just past noon. The glare bouncing off the unbroken white landscape hit his retinas like ground glass. He squinted, throwing an arm over his face, his breath pluming in the freezing, utterly still air. He had dug a trench from the cabin door to the woodpile, and from the woodpile out towards the tree line where the deer carcass hung. The walls of the trench were chest-high, packed tight, and glowing a faint glacial blue in the shadows. Behind him, the rhythmic scrape of a wooden snow shovel stopped. Sadie stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on the handle. Her face was flushed, glowing with a thin sheen of sweat despite the sub-zero temperature. She had spent the last 4 hours hauling the snow. Harlan kicked back, clearing the path inch by agonizing inch. She looked past him, taking in the alien landscape. The familiar shapes of the pines were gone, replaced by massive, bloated white mounds. The world was utterly silent. Air hurts your lungs, she rasped, pulling her scarf up over her nose. It's 30 below. Harlan grunted, stepping out of the trench and onto the hard crust of the drift. The snow held his weight for a second before his boot punched through, sinking him to his mid-thigh. He swore, dragging his leg out. We need the snowshoes if we're going to check the meat cache. I'll get them. She didn't wait for a thank you. She turned back into the cabin. They operated like this now. The hostility had burned off, leaving behind a stark, mechanical efficiency. Words cost energy. Movement had to be purposeful. 10 minutes later they were trudging across the crust, the wide webbing of the ashwood snowshoes keeping them afloat. Harlan led the way, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his left arm. The cold was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It froze the moisture in their nostrils and made their eyelashes clump with ice. They reached the massive oak tree. The buck Harlan had strung up was still there, wrapped in a canvas tarp, but the snow beneath it was trampled, marked by massive, overlapping depressions. Harlan stopped dead. He slid his thumb over the hammer of the Winchester, pulling it back with a loud metallic clack. "Get behind me," he ordered, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Sadie didn't ask questions. She stepped into his shadow, gripping her wooden shovel tight. The smell hit them before the animal showed itself. It was a rank, sour odor of unwashed fur and starving desperation cutting sharply through the clean scent of pine and ozone. A low, vibrating rumble emanated from the brush just beyond the oak. It wasn't a growl. It was a warning felt in the teeth. A mountain lion stepped out from behind a snow-draped boulder. It was massive, but skeletal. Its tawny winter coat was matted with ice, and burrs pulling tight over ribs that jutted out like a washboard. Its yellow eyes were locked on the canvas-wrapped meat hanging in the tree. Then they snapped to Harlan. "Don't run," Harlan muttered, bringing the rifle stock tight against his shoulder. "You run, it trips your prey instinct. It'll snap your neck before you make 10 yards. The cat lowered its head, its shoulder blades rising higher than its spine. It didn't want to fight, but it was starving. Starvation made predators do stupid things. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its massive paws sinking into the powder. Harlan aimed for the center of the chest. He needed a clean kill. If he just wounded it, the beast would thrash, and in this deep snow, they couldn't maneuver fast enough to escape a set of flailing claws. He squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell with a dull, hollow click. Misfire. The freezing temperatures had thickened the gun oil, slowing the firing pin just enough to prevent it from striking the primer. Harlan's stomach plummeted. He racked the lever frantically, ejecting the useless brass cartridge. It spun through the air, flashing gold in the sun, and vanished into the snow. He slammed the lever back, loading a fresh round. The metallic clatter triggered the cat. It lunged. It didn't leap. It exploded forward, a desperate blur of muscle and teeth, covering the distance in 2 terrifying bounds. Harlan brought the rifle up like a club, bracing for the impact. Suddenly, a loud, violent whoosh of flame erupted past Harlan's right ear. A burning piece of split pine glowing with red-hot coals and trailing thick black smoke sailed through the air. It struck the snow directly between the cat's front paws, exploding into a shower of sparks and hissing steam. The cougar shrieked a terrifying human-like scream. The sudden burst of fire and the blinding steam broke its charge. It skidded in the snow, twisting its body violently to avoid the heat. It locked eyes with them for one final hateful second before scrambling up the nearest pine tree, disappearing into the dense upper branches. Harlan lowered the rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He turned his head slowly. Sadie was standing right behind him. She had dropped the snow shovel. In her heavily mittened hand, she held the iron fire poker. She had run back to the cabin, dug a blazing brand out of the stove, and carried it across the snow without him even noticing. Her chest was heaving, her grey eyes wide and wild. "It was going for our meat," she said, her voice shaking violently. "Not your meat, our meat!" Harlan stared at her. The wind whipped a loose strand of dull brown hair across her face. She was terrified, freezing and clutching an iron stick, but she hadn't backed down. She had stepped in front of a starving cat for a frozen deer carcass. "Yeah." Harlan breathed out the adrenaline, slowly leaving his muscles. He reached out his thick, leather-gloved hand, wrapping over hers, pushing the heavy iron poker down. "It was. Let's get it cut down and get inside before that cat figures out it's still hungry." February didn't bring blizzards, just a deep, cracking freeze that sucked the moisture straight from the marrow. The cabin became a cramped furnace in a sea of deadly, silent cold. The physical toll of the mountain was finally catching up to Sadie. She had put on a little weight from the steady diet of venison fat, but her skin was paying the tax. Washing clothes in melted snow, then immediately exposing her wet skin to the blistering, dry heat of the cast-iron stove had ruined her hands. Her knuckles were mapped with deep weeping fissures. The skin was raw, crusted with dried blood. She tried to hide them, keeping her fists balled in her apron. But Harlan saw the way she winced every time she gripped a piece of firewood. It was late evening. The wind was a low, steady drone against the logs. A kerosene lamp cast a hard yellow circle over the table. Sadie sat by the stove, forcing a heavy steel needle through the heel of Harlan's thickest wool sock. It required effort. Every time she pushed the needle through the dense weave, the split on her right thumb stretched. A bead of fresh blood welled up, smearing a rusty streak across the grey wool. Across the room, Harlan was running his hunting knife over a whetstone. Shh, shh. He stopped. He watched the blood soak into the fabric. Setting the knife down, he stood and walked to the heavy wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. He dug through a pile of canvas bags until he found a small, dented brass tin. He walked over to the stove and pulled up a stool, planting himself directly in front of her. "Give me the sock," he said. Sadie looked up, pulling her hands back defensively. "I'm almost finished. It's just a thick weave. Give me the sock." Her jaw tightened a familiar flare of stubborn pride, but she handed it over. Harlan tossed it onto the table behind him. He popped the lid off the tin. The heavy raw scent of sheep's wool and crushed clover hit the stale air. "Give me your hands." She buried them immediately in her lap. "They're fine. It's just winter dry. They're infected, Sadie. You keep dragging coarse wool over open cuts, you'll get blood poisoning. I'm not digging a grave in this frost. I'm not dying from a cracked knuckle, she snapped. Harlan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or reach for her. He simply sat there, holding the open tin, his dark eyes fixed on hers. He was an immovable object against her frantic need to prove she didn't need anyone. The silence stretched. The tin clock ticked on the mantel. Finally, with a heavy, defeated exhale, she pulled her hands out. She held them forward, hovering over his knees, palms down. In the lantern light, they looked mangled. Red, swollen, torn open. Harlan slid his hands underneath hers. His hands were massive, calloused, and shockingly warm. He didn't grab her wrists. He just provided a shelf for her battered hands to rest on. Sadie flinched at the sudden heat, her shoulders twitching, but she didn't pull away. He scooped a thick glob of pale yellow lanolin with his thumb. He pressed it against her bleeding knuckles, slowly working the heavy grease into the broken skin. He was incredibly gentle. For a man who slaughtered his own meat and chopped wood with violent precision, his touch was slow and deliberate. He mapped the rough patches, his thumb smoothing the heavy salve over the fissures. Stings, she whispered, her voice tight in her throat. For a minute he rumbled, not looking up. It'll numb out. He worked the grease down into the webbing of her fingers. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was purely clinical. Survival maintenance. But in the suffocating isolation of the cabin, the simple skin-on-skin contact felt deafening. Sadie stared down at their hands. The contrast of his dark, weathered skin beneath her pale, raw fingers made her chest ache. My husband, she started the words slipping out before she could stop them. He used to say my hands were too rough, said a woman ought to have soft hands, like silk. Harlan didn't pause. He scooped more lanolin, moving to her left hand. He rubbed the salve deep into a split on her index finger. Your husband was a fool, Harlan stated flatly, his voice devoid of pity. Silk is useless out here. It catches on the briars and rots in the damp. He finished working the grease into her skin, but he didn't let go. He kept his hands cupped under hers, letting his body heat melt the lanolin deeply into her pores. When he finally looked up, his guarded, cynical armor was gone, leaving only cold, hard truth. I don't want soft hands in my cabin, Sadie, he said, the words carrying the heavy weight of an anvil. I want hands that can hold an iron poker when a cat comes for our meat. You understand me? Sadie stared at him, a tight knot forming in her throat. She nodded slowly. Good. Harlan withdrew his hands, leaving hers slick and radiating heat. He stood up, picked up the brass tin, and walked back to his whetstone. Sadie sat by the fire, holding her greased hands in her lap. The sharp, throbbing sting was fading, replaced by a deep, anchoring warmth. For the first time since she fled Nevada, she didn't feel broken. She felt exactly right. Spring did not arrive on the mountain with blooming flowers and birdsong. It came like a bleeding wound. By late April, the massive snowdrifts began to rot from the bottom up, collapsing into a thick, sucking grey mud that smelled of decaying pine needles and wet earth. The constant maddening drip, drip, drip of melting ice off the cabin eaves replaced the howling wind. It was a messy, ugly season, but it meant survival. They had made it. Sadie was 50 yards down the southern slope, a woven basket hooked over her arm. She was digging through the patchy slush, hunting for the sharp green shoots of wild mountain onions. Her hands, though scarred and permanently roughened, were healed. She moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, the oversized wool coat finally traded for a faded canvas jacket Harlan had dug out of a trunk. Harlan was on the cabin roof, straddling the peak, wedging fresh cedar shakes over a spot where the winter storms had torn the old shingles loose. His right shoulder still throbbed when the damp hit it, but the joint held. He paused, a wooden mallet resting against his thigh. He wiped a streak of dirty sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. Then he heard it. It wasn't a bear pushing through the brush, and it wasn't the light, nervous step of a deer. It was the heavy, rhythmic suction cup sound of iron-shod hooves pulling out of deep mud. multiple hooves. Harlan's gut tightened a cold, heavy stone, dropping into his stomach. He slowly lowered the mallet. He looked down the trail. 3 riders were picking their way up the final switchback. They weren't locals. Oakhaven men rode thick-barreled draft crosses meant for pulling stumps. These men rode tall, lean Nevada Mustangs, their coats caked with dried clay. They wore long canvas dusters, stained dark at the hems, and sat their saddles with the lazy, arrogant slouch of men who got paid to cause pain. Harlan didn't shout. He didn't scramble. He slid silently down the pitch of the roof, his boots hitting the muddy ground with a dull thud. He walked unhurriedly into the cabin, pulled his Winchester from the wall pegs, checked the action, and stepped back out onto the porch. Down the slope Sadie froze. She had heard them too. She stood up slowly, the basket of wild onions dropping from her fingers. The bitter, sharp scent of crushed stems wafted up the hill. The lead rider pulled his Mustang to a halt at the edge of the clearing. He was a thick-necked man with a face like a slab of raw beef, a heavy mustache hiding his upper lip. He spat a stream of black tobacco juice into the pristine slush. He didn't look at Harlan on the porch. His eyes went straight to Sadie. "Well, I'll be damned," the man rasped, his voice grating like an iron file. "Company man said you headed north, but I figured you'd have frozen solid by Cheyenne." Sadie didn't move. She didn't speak. She looked small against the backdrop of the massive pines, the old hunted look returning to her slate-grey eyes instantly. Harlan stepped off the porch. The mud sucked at his boots, squelching loudly in the tense silence. He walked until he was standing exactly between Sadie and the riders. He held the rifle casually in his right hand, the barrel angled down, but his grip was white-knuckled. "You're lost," Harlan said. The exact words he had spoken to Sadie 6 months ago, but the tone was entirely different. It was a flat, dead sound, a promise of violence. The lead rider finally looked at him amused. He shifted his weight, resting his hand casually on the leather pommel of his saddle, inches from a holstered revolver. "Ain't lost friend," the man said, pulling a folded piece of heavy paper from his duster pocket. "Name's Cole, working for the Silver Lode Mining Company. We're here to collect a bad debt. No debtors up here, just trees and rocks." "Sure there is," Cole grinned, tapping the paper against his saddle horn. "Got a contract right here. Signed by a Mr. William Miller transferring ownership of his wife to the company store for $600 in arrears. That little stray standing behind you happens to be company property. We're taking her back." Harlan felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. The rage didn't explode, it calcified. It turned ice-cold and razor-sharp. He thought about the bruised, freezing woman who had dragged herself up his mountain. He thought about the way she had stepped in front of a starving mountain lion with nothing but a fire poker. He thought about the smell of lanolin and the rough, calloused warmth of her hands. "Property. Contracts void," Harlan said quietly. Cole let out a barking laugh. The 2 men behind him shifted their hands, drifting toward their belts. "I don't think you understand the law, Mountain Man. This paper says she comes with us. You step aside and we won't have to burn your nice little cabin down to stay warm tonight." "I understand the law fine," Harlan replied, his voice barely carrying over the dripping of the snowmelt. He thumbed the hammer of the Winchester back. The metallic clack echoed off the trees like a cannon shot. The 3 horses danced, nervously pulling at their bits. Cole's smile vanished. "Nevada law applies in Nevada," Harlan stated, stepping forward. "You're in Colorado territory. You're at 6,000 feet. There ain't no sheriff there, ain't no judge, and there ain't no company store. I got 3 guns that say different." Cole sneered, his hand dropping to his revolver. Harlan didn't blink. "You got 3 frozen, tired men on exhausted horses. I've been shooting the eyes out of running elk on this ridge for 10 years. You clear leather Cole, and I guarantee you won't live long enough to hear the gunshot." The silence stretched taut and vibrating. The smell of wet horsehair and sour sweat mingled with the sharp tang of ozone that always preceded a storm. Harlan's eyes were dead. Empty. He wasn't posturing. He was doing the brutal math of survival, calculating which man to drop first, how long it would take to work the lever where the 3rd man would fall. Cole saw it. Men who killed for a living recognized men who killed to survive. The bluff was called. $600 is a lot of money to die for, friend. Cole said, his voice losing its arrogant edge. You willing to bleed for a woman who ain't even yours? Harlan didn't look back at Sadie. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence behind him, an anchor in the shifting mud. She ain't property. Harlan said the words heavy and deliberate, sinking into the silence like stones in deep water. And she ain't a stray. She's my wife. The word hung in the air, changing the barometric pressure of the clearing. Sadie inhaled sharply, a ragged, stuttering sound. Cole stared at Harlan, his eyes flicking from the dark, scarred face of the mountain man to the unwavering barrel of the Winchester. He weighed the paper in his hand against the absolute certainty of death in Harlan's eyes. Slowly, deliberately, Cole lifted his hand away from his holster. Mountains make men crazy, Cole muttered, reining his horse around. The mud squelched violently in protest. Company ain't gonna pay me enough to dig a grave in this rock. Keep the crazy bitch. He gestured to the other two men. They didn't argue. They turned their exhausted mustangs and began the slow, treacherous descent back down the switchback, their shoulders hunched against the damp chill. Harlan didn't lower the rifle until the sound of their hooves faded completely beneath the dripping of the eaves. When he finally let the hammer down, his right shoulder gave a vicious throb, punishing him for the tension. He ignored it. He stood there in the mud, staring at the empty trail. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. He had broken his own rule. He had claimed someone. He had tied himself to another human being, not for a season, not for survival, but for good. He heard the soft, dragging squelch of boots in the mud behind him. Sadie walked up to his side. She was shivering, though the air wasn't nearly cold enough to warrant it. She looked at his profile, her slate-grey eyes wide, searching his face for regret, for anger, for the familiar trap of a man claiming ownership. She found none of it. Harlan turned to look at her. His face was unreadable, his beard damp with mist. He looked at her rough hands, at the wild, dull brown hair escaping her braid, at the fierce, unbroken spirit that had terrified him all winter. You didn't have to say that, she whispered, her voice rough, stripped of its usual armor. You could have paid them. You have gold in the floorboards. I know you do. You could have bought the paper. Harlan frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. I don't buy people, Sadie. A piece of paper doesn't mean a damn thing. But you said. She stopped, swallowing hard, unable to force the word out. I said what I meant. Harlan looked away, suddenly intensely interested in the mud on his boots. He wasn't a man for speeches. He didn't know how to navigate the soft, messy terrain of emotion. He only knew action. He knew wood and iron and snow. He reached out his massive, calloused hand, wrapping around her forearm. Not pulling, not forcing. Just anchoring. You asked me a question last November, he said, his voice a low rumble. Another winter alone or a wife. I gave you my answer. Sadie stared at him, the tension slowly draining out of her spine. The terrible, suffocating weight she had carried since she fled Nevada, the fear of being hunted, of being owned, of being a burden, finally cracked and shattered. She wasn't a stray. She wasn't a debt. She looked down at his hand on her arm, the warmth bleeding through the canvas sleeve. A slow, genuine smile, the first he had ever seen, broke across her face. It didn't make her look softer. It made her look radiant, like the sun finally breaking through a week of storm clouds. She reached her rough, lanolin-heeled hand up and rested it flat against his chest, right over the heavy thud of his heart. The roof needs patching, she said softly, her voice steady and grounded. Spring rains are coming. Harlan's chest expanded as he took a deep, clear breath of the sharp pine air. He covered her hand with his own. I know, he muttered, the corners of his eyes crinkling. I was working on it before we got interrupted. Put the onions inside. I'll be down in an hour. She nodded, pulling her hand back slowly. She bent down, retrieving her dropped basket from the mud, and walked toward the cabin. She didn't look back over her shoulder to see if he was watching. She knew he was. Harlan stood in the mud for a moment longer, looking at the solid oak door of his cabin. It used to be a fortress built to keep the world out. Now it was just a door. He turned, walked to the side of the building, and began the slow, painful climb back up the ladder. He had work to do, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't mind the effort. And that's the end of Harlan and Sadie's story. They didn't just survive the mountain, they survived their pasts to build something real and unbreakable in the mud and the snow. If this raw, gritty take on Wild West romance kept you hooked, please hit that like button and share it with fellow story lovers. Don't forget to subscribe for more deeply human-grounded tales that skip the cliches and get straight to the heart. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment between these two stubborn survivors? See you in the next one.